Overview A, civilization and rationality, the technical aspect of rationality, the moral dimension of rationality, the divine tutoring of reason. For A, B is Sinai and rationality, the revelation at Sinai, the Noahide laws and the rational aspect of revelation. C, Noahide law, the content of the 7 Noahide laws, residual Noahide law based on rationality. Society and ascent, that's part D. The criteria of an ascending rationality, the conditions of ascending rationality, and the order of Noahide law. So we're going to begin talking about just in terms of rational moral conduct based on divine fundamental principles, divine values. The second part is ethics and conduct based on the revelation of Sinai. And then C is the actual content of those laws as it pertains to the nations. And D is about a society that wants to take it to the next level, above the Noahide laws. This idea of society in ascent. The society is going even higher. All right, so let's start A, civilization and rationality. Because there's this idea that the B'nai Noach community has an obligation also to keep things that are rationally ethical, as well as things that are from revelation. Let's see how he sets it up. A, civilization and rationality. The technical aspect of rationality. The most basic sense of civilization is that of the peaceful habitation of the world. So this idea is often considered really the whole umbrella principle behind the Noahide laws is to create a peaceful, habitable civilization world. The distinctively human way of achieving this has been through reason or rationality. Human beings have reached peace, the peaceful habitation, through reasoning, through intellect. Initially, reason is applied. It's interesting, he says that because some people equate peace with love. But he's saying that peace actually comes about through reason. So that's an interesting idea to contemplate, as opposed to, because it is true, love, we can love, often love means loving one person and hating another one, or being jealous of another one. But it's reason that helps us balance those feelings. And it helps us realize that if we want to function, we should all work together and to overcome any type of, instinctive divisiveness, emotional self-centeredness that we may have. Goes on to say on page 136, initially reason is applied to the cultivation and utilization of nature. Okay, so the first thing we use with reason is to improve the natural world and to utilize it for human needs. Crops must be grown, clothing made, dwellings constructed, and the energies of nature drawn into productive technologies. Human rationality is able to devise and calculate means of managing nature quite unlike the way the animals survive in it. It's a very important point. And if you have pets, you probably noticed this interesting thing about the animal mind. If you, put let's say, a big pillow in the path of an animal, like my cat, for instance, they're going to walk around it. They're going to move around it. The mind of an animal works is, how do I adapt within the world as it exists right now? It doesn't think to change what nature presents, but just how to cope with what nature presents is how the animal brain works. But the human brain takes it to a whole other level, in which what can I do to change, utilize, exploit in the natural world for the needs that I have to survive. So it's a very, very different, I want to get something at the bottom of the mountain. I can drill a hole in a mountain. That's not something that animals, well, there are some animals that dig holes. I'm not going to say that, yeah, there are animals that dig holes. That's their particular, instinct. But generally speaking, they adapt and work around what's in nature as opposed to trying to change it and mold it and so on. Okay, anyway. Human being commands nature not by superior strength or other animal powers, but through reason's science. Science began as the knowledge of the use of simple tools. It became increasingly theoretical and was powerfully applied to every domain of human existence. It is employed not only in the encounter with physical nature, but also in the study of the human being as a psychological person, in social organization, in forms of abstract reflection, such as art and philosophy. They're all included in science. All of these domains of science have an instrumental dimension in that they deliver results, be it in orientation, a personality, a crop, a successful organization, or an artwork. They're all looking for some type of result, some type of improvement to organize, to reach some type of objective through the scientific approach and knowledge. There is a more primary technical aspect of collective or socialized human activity, which we find in the cultural character of individual societies. A society has a temperament expressed through typical thought styles, a language, the characteristic idioms and features of natural character, and forms of social administrative practice. So besides the science is just culture, I think is what he's saying. But technical culture, things that structure human activity and how human beings get along. Society has a temperament expressed through, okay, read that sentence, next. All of these are independent of and prior to the values they come to serve. The one and the same culture could express the most diverse values, as did East Germany, which within a short period was democratic, fascist, communist, and democratic again. The primary culture temperament expressed through the instruments of thought, language, and folkways, themselves undergoing modification over time, constitutes the basic identity of the society throughout its technical and moral history. Okay, so he's basically, I think he's talking about different cultural and social ways that different societies have. It's not government, it's to do with community, society, how people get along, and their language, their things like holidays, things like shared belief in a history, I guess. Also religious practices. And also, kind of like clan leadership, things of hierarchy, social hierarchies that aren't governed by from the top down, but based on law or scientific theory, but are just developed because this is how society has done things for a very, very long time. We don't have it as much in the United States, but we still find it, whether it's in families or bigger communities, but particularly in other societies like in India, Pakistan, or countries like this, you see it more. Saudi Arabia, for that matter, you may see more of this. Okay. Certainly, it's more pronounced. We all have it in terms of how a culture functions outside of science or outside of the law. Okay, he continues. So the point is really just saying is that science and culture are the ways that a society organizes itself. The moral dimension of it, so it's still pretty deep stuff. You can't get away from it. It's a deep book. But let's continue. The moral dimension of rationality. The ability technically to command nature is only part of the biblical mandate given to the human to fill the earth and subdue it. So he's just explaining that the command to fill the earth and subdue it that was said to Adam not only about the technical ability to exploit natural materials, The complete sense of this mandate is to elevate it to a moral and then to a spiritual ideal. It's really to elevate the world for moral and spiritual uses. Thus, technical rationality is necessary but insufficient to define civilization. So it's not enough just to be technically advanced to be deemed a civilization in terms of from a divine perspective, from a Noahide perspective. A society priding itself in the highest technical rationality of history to its day, interwar Germany, in other words, interwar between the First and Second World Wars, carried out under Nazism the worst atrocities in history. Without definable moral standards, a society's technical advance can be also a cause for anxiety in the event of its misuse. So he's pointing out that technical advances alone can be the cause for the opposite of a peaceful civilization, an harmonious civilization. Whatever the level, one more point there is that he says that what such a society is lacking is definable moral standards, obviously also objective moral standards that are coming from without, coming from the transcendent, right? Now, next sentence, whatever the level of development of its technical rationality, a crucial standard for civilization is the values which its technical capabilities made to serve. So the technical is really represents another T word, which is tools. It's a tool in order to carry out objectives that are based on the receipt or the accomplishment of certain values. And the question is, what are those values? What are we trying to accomplish? Is it just wealth? Is it certain other forms of gratification, or is there more to it? This more comprehensive concept of rationality is thus its extension to the idea of a moral or social technical ordering of the world. So the world should be ordered and directed like a compass based on certain moral and social values. This complete sense of the human mandate to fill and subdue in turn needs, and in fact has as a divine mandate and summons, a substantive guide and criterion in the form of divine values for that moral or social ordering. So the idea is that the world should be subdued and controlled by man in a way in which man directs that control towards the divine values. In other words, the idea is he's truly civilizing the world and bringing it up to a higher level morally, ethically, and spiritually. That's the intent, not simply that to give man a license to exploit the world, but to control it in order to upraise it. An eternal God has an eternal ethical will, an unchanging moral template for his creation. So that's an important principle he's laying out there, that just as God is eternal, so too his values are eternal. They don't change. Now on page 138, the divine tutoring of reason. The questions of whether there are objective, enduring, universal values, and if so, what these are, go together. So the big question of are there values and what they are, there's one answer. One is tempted to find guidance in this matter by going to the question, what norms do we in fact find have been continuous or salient throughout the history of humanity? A person may be tempted just to look at human history to figure out what the basic values are. Which values have proven most durable in the face of all kinds of social challenges? So there may be a tendency to follow that question to come to an answer. Indeed, one does find certain convergences among the great religiously based cultures. We do find a parallel of certain values that seem to overlap or repeat themselves among the great religious cultures of the world. At the same time, however, the record of history is not necessarily the recommended reference place for morality. There has been much enduring with horrifically intensified moments of moral darkness. In other words, there's been a lot of moral failure in the great societies of the world too. So it's just to look historically wouldn't be no guarantee that we will have the right values needed to create the, peaceful, harmonious, morally good society we're looking for. Nevertheless, common and historically enduring and recurring values do point to a common resonance, a common spiritual root consciousness. So these values that we find in these great religious societies do point to something, although they may not have gotten 100% right, but the similarities are pointing to something. A common spiritual root, consciousness, from which these common values of their individual variations proceed. In other words, it's teaching us that there must be certain common values that are coming from, I guess you could say intuitively, or maybe from the beginning of history of where humanity began, which, in other words, the fact that all these societies have similar values point to some original beginning, or if not, then some intuitive root in all peoples that lead them to these values. So what we want to really do is not examine those ancient societies or modern societies with their religious values, go back to the beginning. The answers come in response to the question of the divine mandate itself. Why and for what purpose did God create the world and give the human being a unique agency in it? Those are the big questions nobody wants to think about. They just want to turn on their TV. That's the scary stuff, right? What's the purpose of life? As far as humanity is concerned, it was in order to model the creation on divine values. Purpose of the world for human beings, what's our purpose? Is to model creation on divine values. These values are to be found in the resonance of two objectivities, God and the human soul. So we find these values in God and in the human soul, made by the biblical testimony in the image of God. The soul is made in the image of God. So we find the same values in the soul as we find in God himself. So this gets back to what we did start at the beginning of the book, and then we skipped, but the idea that following the divine laws of Noah is not a form of repression and restriction, but it's something natural to the soul itself. It's something natural that belongs to all of us. Okay, the concept of universal ethical values, or a common human conscience, spiritual consciousness, is related to the biblical notion of the ability of the human being to imitate God. The values of the common conscience, or soul in the human being, are universal and eternal because they imitate the one God, who's also eternal. So since it is an imitation of God, it's always the same, who fashioned in the human soul and replicated in it his own unique set of attributes. These divine attributes are godly ways, which translate into the concrete norms of human conduct, namely those set out in the Noahide laws. So the Noahide laws are actually God's ways himself. It's his own modes of conduct that God himself carries out. So too man, through the soul, follows that example. In other words, being led by the natural tendencies that are in the soul, follows that example and imitates God. The human being transcends towards God, rising above mere personal, emotional or mental biases and interests. His common conscience or soul is revealed. So when a person so it's very interesting. Sometimes we just really, a lot of getting to meaning, a lot of getting to truth has to do with just disregarding and silencing our emotional and mental biases and self-interests. And once we do that, the common conscience inside of us has a chance to speak and reveal itself, but needs also to be educated and trained in the tradition which articulates these values. However, that isn't enough. It needs to be educated and trained in the specifics of these values, right? These divine norms or values can also wear the title of rationality, because they have created and defined what for humanity is authentic rationality. In other words, it's a rationality based on these objective, timeless values. This concept is expressed by one of the great codifiers of the biblical tradition, who states that although the Noahide laws have a rational character and intellect inclines towards them, they are nevertheless learned from divine revelation. It's quoting Rambam, Maimonides, in chapter 9 of the Laws of Kings. So these laws are rational, the intellect inclines towards them, but at the end of the day, they're learned from divine revelation. That is to say, the truly rational contour of reason has been taught by God. Character of the Noahide laws is that they make sense. They are assimilable to reason, but they are God-given. So in other words, they are given by God, but once a person hears them, they make sense. Once you hear them, you're able to understand what they mean and apply them in a rational way and distinguish between when it should be, how it's applied, when will it apply, and so on. Person can also integrate them, internalize them into these values into himself, even though they're transcendent and divine. This concept of rationality applies equally to the divine laws which govern private conduct, meaning between the individual person and God, as to those which govern public conduct between person and person. And so also the ethical human relationship with nature. They're all assimilable. They're all forms of conducts, modes of conducts that can be internalized with the person, and the person has a feeling that they're reasonable. And that also that the specific details of those laws will also make sense. The person will be able to judge for themselves applicability and so on. Will be able to study them, basically. Thus, while the human being is fitted with a soul, a divine receptor, this alone does not fully prepare one to discover by him or herself the structure and detail of divine law. Having a soul and an intuitive feeling of right and wrong isn't enough. Rather, this law was received from God by revelation, which was then historically transmitted with its elucidation from Sinai. So it was a prophecy given to man through communication from God to man. And then it was historically transmitted and elucidated, commented upon, fully elaborated upon from Sinai. The primary significance of the human soul is that it is able to receive, resonate with, and thereby confirm this divine law, communicated to it by tradition, which originates definitively at Sinai. So in other words, when a person studies it, the soul, senses that this is divine and this is truth, and it resonates with the person, and they can take it upon themselves to carry it out. There is a considerable diversity amongst traditions and societies and their substantive laws and customs. This is intrinsically valuable so long as it is not in contradiction to common and universal moral ground, the shared imitation of God expressed in the Noahide laws. So he's basically saying that nations and cultures should not abandon their own traditions to adopt a Jewish form of Noahide law. But when I say that, I mean to say, in other words, that the Noahide, keeping of the 7 laws doesn't have to have a Jewish personality to it. It can simply be keeping those specific forms of conduct, and yet the nation keeps its own, identity and culture and so on. The fact of human difference needs no defense and will always assert itself. What requires definition, defense, and assertion is the common ground stated in the primordial moral covenant of God and humanity in the Noahide laws, with its fundamental reiteration at Sinai. It was the revelation at Sinai that made known and gave definitive form and authority to the Noahide laws, in which humanity was already commanded before Sinai. So I'm looking, it's a very important sentence there, and I'm trying to dissect it. As he says that at the revelation of Sinai, known, that's one point. Two, gave definitive form, and then finally an authority to the Noahide laws. So the question is, how was Moses' giving or receiving of the Noahide laws at Sinai, how did that change the 7 laws of Noah? So in this sentence here, he's saying that it publicized them, it gave them further definitive form and detail, and I guess additional authority, being that Moses was the greatest prophet. And the authority of these laws became, I think, ascended to even a higher level. Okay. Well, let me stop here a moment. Any questions so far? We had a point made in the chat by Ross, which was that one might say is cross-cultural, that the 7 Noahide laws are cross-cultural. Exactly. Any other comments, questions so far? Okay. But it is something to keep in mind, just in general, the importance of reason within the context of Noahide law and instruction. B, Sinai and rationality. The revelation at Sinai. At Mount Sinai, over 3,300 years ago, the 10 Commandments were given before the assembled Jewish people. In both the spiritual and historical sense, there was, however, also a divine communication, a great voice, which went out and down through history to all humanity. 10 Commandments are the core of a revelation, which was subsequently communicated to Moses in its totality in the 5 books of Moses. So the 10 Commandments are the core, and the rest of the 5 books are the total revelation to Moses. Of course, I think he must be implying also the oral law, which is also communicated, which is hinted to and interpreted through 5 books. Okay, this contains altogether 620 commandments, comprised of 613 commandments addressed to the Jewish people, and 7 commandments, the Noahide laws, addressed to humanity. So they're really Noahide commandments, right? Sometimes I kind of like that, calling them that better than laws, but same idea. The relationship of the 10 Commandments to this complete body of revelation as its core is symbolically represented by the fact that the Hebrew text of the 10 Commandments contains 620 letters. So the amount of letters in the 10 Commandments is the same as the combination of all the laws given to both Israel and the nations. The 10 Commandments were and are experienced as foundational for both the Jewish commandments and the Noahide commandments individually. Fascinating. So the 10 Commandments are also foundational for Noahide commandments. Which again, it's interesting because the 10 Commandments are just so widely accepted as being the basis of divine law by so much of the world. Okay. Then the universal, I'm on page 142 now. The universal part of the revelation, the Noahide laws, had already been communicated to humanity before Sinai. Thus, tradition teaches that at the time of the creation of the first persons, Adam and Eve, the divine harmony was manifest in the world, and this was maintained by the fulfillment of the first 6 of what were to become known as the Noahide laws or commandments. Page 143 now. 10 generations later, humanity, largely obliterated by the flood, had a new point of origin in the survivor of the flood, Noah, who was given the 7th universal law, completing the 7 Noahide laws incumbent upon all humanity. His descendants, namely the 70 nations of earth, which came from Noah, from which all subsequent nationalities and peoples derived. This covenant over a span of 10 generations reached Abraham, the point of origin of the major world cultures, Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. There is a tradition that also indirectly, through his sons, whom he sent off to the east, Abraham's influence also reached Hinduism and consequently also its derivative Buddhism. However, these various world religious traditions may have individually developed. The Noahide laws are sedimented in their Abrahamic origins or historical spiritual pre-consciousness. In other words, the Noahide laws are their original root, even though they may have changed or gone off course along the way. The significance of the reiteration of the Noahide laws in the great voice of Sinai is twofold. So this is the point. What was the point of having the 7 laws re-given at Sinai? So there's two points. First, that at Sinai, the content of the Noahide laws was now given its authoritative form and definition, meaning its authority was Sinai and given to Moses. That's what I think he means. Secondly, the true piety and reward for fulfillment of the Noahide laws would henceforth be on account of their acceptance as having been stated at Sinai by God through Moses. So that's become a condition for perfection and the true piety in keeping the Noahide laws, that it should be done for the reason that it was given to Moses at Sinai. So really that creates a relationship between all mankind and Moses, because they're fulfilling the commands as given to Moses. And Moses is the teacher of all mankind. And it also means that all of mankind is responding to the event of Sinai, which was an incredible revelation of divinity that took place at that time. So again, it's another reason why all of mankind is connected and bound to the revelation of Sinai, in a certain sense, to the 10 Commandments. In other words, the statements of "I am the Lord your God" and that whole experience, there the 7 laws are rooted there, and they spring forth from that experience. Okay. Even though they're not equivalent to the literal 10 Commandments, but it's kind of like the same holiness of the 10 Commandments is that it's the source for both the laws and commandments given to Israel and to the nations. Okay. Bottom of page 143. The reason why the covenant had its definitive renewal at Sinai is that the voice which spoke at Sinai told humanity was not simply prophecy, meaning that of Moses, but an unprecedented manifestation of God himself. Wow, that's a powerful point there. So the reason is because it's a command directly from God, not to the prophet and the prophet telling everyone else, but it's being received directly from God himself. Just as the essence of God is eternal, so is his essential ethical will, included in the Noahide law communicated at Sinai. It's also eternal. Page 144 then. It is prohibited to add to or subtract from this fundamental body of divine commandments. Traditions may rightly develop with their own customs and practices, which do not contradict these laws, as mentioned above. And they may add further stringencies, restrictions, and standards, as discussed below. But the divinely commanded spiritual conception thank you. But the divinely commanded spiritual conceptual whole of Noahide law remains as it was given at Sinai. So in other words, a nation may have its own culture, but the concepts and form of development of Noahide law remains as it was given to Moses. So basically what they're saying is a society can have its own culture, but when it comes to Noahide law, they need a rabbi. I don't mean that in a literal sense, but the point is they have to follow the concepts of Noahide law and their values, and also the different means of balancing it. I mean, it seems to be an allusion to that idea that when it comes to the Noahide law, it should follow a type of halachic structure, at least one, a structure that's completely and perfectly within it's like in other words, what I'm trying to say is Noahide law cannot be affected by other cultures or other values. Okay, their development has to be just from within itself, from within. You're not going to mix God's morals and values with other things. So a nation, in other words, in its own, can have its own personality, but when it comes to the application of the Noahide laws, it has to follow God's values distinctively and uniquely. Okay. Everybody with me? Any questions on this? Okay.
Just a comment, if I may.
Yeah.
Just to paraphrase, I'm hearing that these are fundamental laws, foundational, basic to the structure of which creation was formed. Would that be a fair statement? That they're applicable to all cultures. It goes across the board.
That's for sure. Yeah.
Yes.
Applicable to all of humankind. Yes, of course.
So, and as a general statement, if any one individual is aware of the complete set, if you will, then the question or the ideology would be to either practice them all and not be selective as to ignoring some portion, whether it be theft or sexual immorality on some level. It's like essentially what it should be is you accept the entire package and keep it whole. Because if you ignore any one aspect of it, you're putting at risk causing damage to the society, to the culture. In other words, if a particular culture were to say, ignore one aspect, whether it be sexual immorality or theft or something, or just a little particular nuance to that one law, that fracture, if you will, has a potential to spread to other areas. One should be diligent in observation of the entirety of the package.
Yeah, certainly. I mean, there's no question about it. I think
well, just I don't want to get too political in some cases, but if one culture, say, ignores or blind eyes bestiality, or another one homosexuality, or just turn a little blind eye on this one little matter, so to speak, abortion, if you will, you see how that can create a problem across the board in other places. In other words, if you don't try to preserve it as a whole, that little crack, if you will be exploited to the nth degree.
Yeah, I mean, it all comes back to the point he's making here is that when these laws, these commandments were kept because they were given by God to Moses at Sinai, then the idea that a society would break one doesn't really have any rational basis, meaning it's not something that would result from that belief and from that principle. In other words, what I'm trying to say in simple terms is the reason societies don't keep a certain Noahide laws because they don't believe in the first principle, which is that these are 7 given by God through Moses. Meaning to say that they're all of equal divine weight. It's not something we decide on whether it's functional or we agree with or not. the reason societies break away or, they drop one is because they don't have the foundation to start with, which is that there are these 7 commandments given by God to Moses, originally to Noah. They don't have that. What they have is some intuitive sense that historically came from this, which makes them say, well, we can't do, adultery isn't good, murder isn't good, theft isn't good, and so on. So they have some basis of this, and obviously these things also just rationally can cause the breakdown of society. Some of them are more clear than other ones, like murder. I mean, everyone understands that if you allow murder rampant, then you have chaos, absolute chaos. So certain things are clearer than others, but nevertheless, to have them all properly, you have to have that foundation that there are there's an objective value of morals that is not up to human determination whether they find favor in our eyes or they don't, whether we decided that their utility is works for us or it doesn't. For example, adultery. Many people feel that many people have that who fall into adultery. It's because they're unhappy, they're unsatisfied, they're depressed in their relationship, whatever it may be. And so from a rational human point of view, they may come to the conclusion that, I need to, well, as they say, cheat, in order to, but the idea of it being a divine commandment is that there's no exceptions. There's no excuses and there are no exceptions. It's not something where you can say, well, that law was only meant, to keep society better and peaceful, but in this case, it's causing me so much harm that clearly wasn't meant for me. There is no such thing when it's a divine law, which means it's something inherently destructive on its own. It's not because for some other reason, because of itself. And that means it's destructive for the person, it's destructive for those around him, because it's part of the very root, you could say mysterious, but the order of creation from the beginning. So, okay. All right. Ross, also, you made this comment about the 620 being the numerical equivalent of the Hebrew word keter. Very good point. Crown. And for one thing, that represents the fact that these commandments bring God's kingdom into the world. Okay, let's go a little bit more. We're going to stop soon. I think we're going to stop by the end of page 144. So one more paragraph. So whilst the voice of Sinai went out to humanity in history, it was the Jewish people who were actually present at Sinai and explicitly received the revelation in its totality. So the Jewish people, are the guardians of this, in fact, of this revelation. To Moses, excuse me, to Moses was given this entire teaching, Torah. The revelation included the beginnings of the tradition of commentary, the oral law, so-called because it was originally transmitted orally, not in a text, which elucidates all the commandments with their applications. He transmitted it to the Jewish people, and their task through the generations has included communicating to humanity the sovereignty of God, the detailed teaching of the Noahide laws, and the attempt to bring about their observance. This is no novelty. The phrase of the prophet, the Jewish people had been placed as a light to the nations, from Isaiah 49, is part of general historical consciousness. The message of the Noahide laws, this voice from Sinai, has been heard also by other great figures of the nations of the world and transmitted down to this day. So in other words, in simple language, what he's saying is that there was a revelation given for the nations, which was given to Moses and the Israelites in order then to communicate it to the nations and teach them and so on. So it's part of the responsibility of the Jewish people to guard this tradition, to guard these laws, to be knowledgeable in these laws, and then to teach them to the nations. And as he breaks it down into the different categories, he says that the task is communicating to humanity the sovereignty of God. That's number one. And number two, the detailed teaching of the Noahide laws. And finally, to attempt to bring about their observance. Those 3 points. So belief in God, teaching the laws, and then trying to encourage their observance. That's the obligation of the Jewish people, of the people, children of Israel, in the world as it should be.